Liberty or equality? The challenge of our time. Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn. 1952. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Preface. Not without an inner emotion and a certain feeling of hesitancy am I offering these pages to the English-speaking public. The emotion is due to the fact that I lived for over 10 years on the hospitable soil of the United States of America, the native land of my second child, which to me is my second home. The hesitancy, on the other hand, is the result of the grim foreboding that this volume will be the cause of several misunderstandings and, in a number of cases, of downright resentment. Yet, as Léon Boy has insisted, it is later than we think, and the time for flattery, self-delusion and cheap optimism is over. An involved situation, a complicated problem, a complex issue cannot be dealt with in a few pages or in a simple way. This task has taxed the mental powers and the physical energies of more than one person. The author had to be assisted by an editor with a greater mastery of English than his own. Of course, as far as the material, the facts, and the views are concerned, these are entirely the author's responsibility. The reader might conceivably ask himself why this book was written and published in this particular situation and at this particular time. Another edition, a German translation, will be published soon in Switzerland. But the author, an Austrian who will never forget his American decade, and his years in Britain, believes that directly as well as indirectly he has dealt with problems which not only lie at the core of that particular internal crisis which darkens the horizons of the Occident's future, but also form the very substance of the great and fatal misunderstanding between the continent and the English-speaking nations. This catastrophic lack of comprehension of the rather opaque world east of Calais, aggravated by confusion about technical terms, is largely responsible for the grave disappointments America, and Britain also, have suffered after each major war won for their ideals. Each triumph for democracy has ended, on the continent, with a frightening setback for the cause of liberty. The years 1917, 1918, 1922, 1933, 1938 were a chain of defeats for the cause of freedom. The Second World War resulted in military victory and political defeat. In order to help Englishmen and Americans to distinguish more clearly between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, the material for this book has been collected, arranged and annotated. It is our fervent hope that we have not altogether failed in this endeavor. Kuehnelt-Leddihn. Lands, Tyrol, June 28, 1951. Chapter 1. Definitions and Basic Principles. This book is an essay in the narrowest sense of the term, an effort to throw some light on certain phases and aspects of the century-old struggle between the principles of freedom and those of equality, between the ideologies of liberalism and of democracy, in their classic sense, of course. It is obvious that this study cannot be exhaustive. Nevertheless, the subjects of our analysis have not been chosen at random, but have been selected for special reasons. Before defining our terms, we think it important to show our hand and to declare our philosophical baggage. It is obvious that any writer trying to analyze political or sociological phenomena critically and methodically will be motivated by a more or less coherent system of philosophy. Since the present author is a Catholic, his philosophy has an intimate relationship with the theology of his church, a relationship which can best be defined as coordination. The principle that philosophy is the handmaid of theology has for him only a personal, but not an intellectual meaning. Although his philosophy is predominantly Thomistic, he is also deeply influenced by a theistic existentialism, and by certain cognitions of the phenomenological school. The Catholic reader who is curious as to the reasons which prompt him to deviate from Neo-Thomism, today so strongly dominating the philosophical scene in Catholic North America, is invited to peruse the note on this subject on pages 164 to 167. The non-Catholic reader will not, we hope, be discouraged by the admission just made. We want to assure him that Thomism, the basis of our philosophy, is not a strange, esoteric creed full of mysterious illusions. It is, on the contrary, a philosophy characterized by the utmost respect for human reason and one which strives towards objective reality. It is a philosophy of horse sense with no patience for solipsism, the denial of sensory apperception and the rejection of the simple laws of logic. Its realism will insist that if statement A is correct, and statement B contradicts A, the latter must be considered to be false. There is nothing magical or mysterious about the tenets of Thomism insofar as they underlie the philosophy of these pages, they represent common sense. At the same time, we are deeply concerned about the psychological reactions of man, either as a person or as an individual lost in a crowd, and about myths and superstitions. Yet we will, naturally, subordinate psychology to philosophy, and feelings, emotions and affections to objective reality, without forgetting the existence of the former. When we talk about freedom and equality, we must realize that we are faced here, to all practical purposes, by relative, not by absolute terms, by trends and tendencies rather than by unalloyed abstractions. Freedom in this study means the greatest amount of self-determination which in a given situation is feasible, reasonable and possible. As a means to safeguarding man's happiness and protecting his personality, it is an intermediary end, and thus forms part of the common good. It is obvious that under these circumstances it cannot be brutally sacrificed to the demands of absolute efficiency nor to efforts towards a maximum of material welfare. Man does not live by bread alone. Here, as in some other basic matters, most readers will probably admit that they see with us eye to eye because, although not belonging to the Church, they are nevertheless adherents and beneficiaries of the Hebrew-Greek Christian tradition, which has something approaching a common denominator. When we speak about equality, we do not refer to equity, which is justice. Even the so-called Christian equality is not something mechanical, but merely subjection under the same law, in other words isonomy. Yet to the Christian two newly born babes are spiritually equal, but their physical and intellectual qualities, the latter of course in potency, are from the moment of conception unequal. We shall not go into the psychological reasons for the egalitarian and identitarian tendencies of our age, which we have dealt with elsewhere. It suffices to say that the artificial establishment of equality is as little compatible with liberty as the enforcement of unjust laws of discrimination. It is obviously just to discriminate, within limits, between the innocent and the criminal, the adult and the infant, the combatant and the civilian, and so on, whereas greed, pride and arrogance are at the base of unjust discrimination. The driving motor of the egalitarian and identitarian trends is envy, jealousy and fear. Nature, i.e., the absence of human intervention, is anything but egalitarian. If we want to establish a complete plain, we have to blast the mountains away and fill the valleys. Equality thus presupposes the continuous intervention of force which, as a principle, is opposed to freedom. Liberty and equality are in essence contradictory. Of all political labels, none have been more frequently misused than the terms liberal and democratic. A liberal is a man or a woman who is interested in having people enjoy the greatest reasonable amount of liberty, and this regardless of the juridical type of government they are living under. It is true that the affinities between liberty and the various political forms are not identical. It is also true that while some political establishments show marked liberal trends, they harbor nevertheless, through their dialectics, the danger of far-reaching enslavement. The fact remains that the true liberal is not pledged to any specific constitution, but would subordinate his choice to the desire to see himself and his fellow citizens enjoying a maximum of liberty. If he thinks that a monarchy would grant greater liberty than a republic, he would choose the former. Under certain circumstances he might even prefer the actual restrictions of a military dictatorship to the potential evolutions of a democracy. Thus any liberal accepting Plato's evaluation of democracy, Republic, Book 8, would reject this form of government because, according to this philosopher, it is fatally doomed to develop into tyranny. In this whole discussion of liberty, it should never be forgotten that the highest liberty, which is at one and the same time inalienable, is ascetic liberty. As anybody with a real knowledge of Europe might expect, the term liberal in its political sense is of Spanish origin. It appears for the first time after 1812 in the Iberian Peninsula, and was soon adopted by the French. Southey, in the Quarterly Review, wrote in 1816 for the first time about British liberalis, and 10 years later we see Scott using the expression libero. This term was used for the radical wing of the Whigs, which is not quite identical with the connotation we attribute to this label. In the United States, a liberal has come to mean a person who welcomes change, and thus would not be averse to embracing or fostering a totalitarian ideology. Thus, genuine liberals, as, for example, the late Oswald Garrison Villar, in order to distinguish themselves from communist sympathizers, like to call themselves old-fashioned liberals. On the European continent the situation was not dissimilar. Their liberals often engaged in a veritable persecution of all those who preferred a different scope of views. Professor Carlton J. H. Hayes very adroitly called them sectarian liberals. The philosophical and psychological motives for the liberal position show a great variety. The driving force in a Christian liberalism will always be affection and generosity. Yet we also know of a liberalism derived from a basic philosophic nihilism, which declares that truth is either a mere prejudice, a piece of intellectual arrogance, a sensory fraud, or that it is humanly unattainable, outside the reach of the faculty of reason. It is obvious that such a philosophy of despair, which we reject, does not necessarily result in a liberal attitude. It may wind up in its opposite, and the type of its evolution thus depends merely on personal preference or temperament. There is another possible motive which can be harmonized with the Christian position, namely, the conviction that illiberalism is bad strategy. While fully accepting the distinction between truth and untruth, and even acknowledging the tenet that untruth has no intrinsic right or claim for toleration, the strategic liberal will reject coercive measures simply because they do not lead to the desired result. For instance, it has been suggested that the Middle Ages died of a sort of uremic poisoning because of the practical impossibility of an individual seceding from the Church. The strongly coercive tendency which crept into the late medieval Church, partly as the result of an invitation by the state, took a couple of centuries to subside. Already in 1818 Pius VII found strong words against the coercive principle, and the Code of Canon Law is explicit on the point that nobody, i.e., no adult, can be forced to become a Catholic. It must be admitted that during the Middle Ages the lower clergy were rather confused on this point. Note the frequent insistence that Jews forcibly baptized were subject to the jurisdiction of the Church. Nevertheless, it could only be a question of time until the full impact of Catholic theology could be felt on the problem of force and coercion. Not only did the Catholic teaching of the supremacy of conscience over all visible authority militate against the late medieval policy, but so also did the precepts of charity. Thus, when handing over a person found guilty to the secular authorities, the inquisitors uttered a standard formula asking the state not to subject the culprit to capital punishment: "We cast thee out from our ecclesiastical court and give thee over, or rather leave thee to the secular arm and the power of the secular court," efficaciously entreating said secular court that it temper its sentence close to and on this side of the shedding of blood and the peril of death. These changes of attitude, on the other hand, have nothing to do with the adamant insistence on the infallibility of the teaching Church in dogmatic matters. Today the possibility of an honest, tragic conflict between conscience and truth is fully admitted. It was bad psychology, not bad philosophy, which imputed bad faith to every heretic or dissenter. In this connection it must also be borne in mind that true liberalism is hardly compatible with an unlimited capitalism of the Manchester School. Property is also a means to freedom. Since private capitalism tends to concentrate property in fewer and fewer hands, it is, from a genuinely liberal point of view, only a lesser evil in comparison with state capitalism, socialism. For the truly liberal solution of the problem of production we have to look to other prophets than Smith and Stalin. The terms democracy and democratic are political. Democracy implies power, rule, of the people. The various sociological and social misuses of these expressions do not interest us here. We have, for example, to place a label like the democratic way of life in that category. Mere affection for the lower classes is not democracy but demophily. The reader is thus solemnly warned that we are dealing with a political concept only. There is a classic concept of democracy, which lasted with minor variations from 500 BC until the middle of the last century. Some people still cling to the classic sense of the term because it alone has a modicum of conciseness and clearness. Plato, Aristotle, St. Thomas, St. Robert Bellarmine, Father Mariana, S.J., Alexander Hamilton, Marshall, Madison, Gouverneur Morris, Fustel de Coulanges, all vaguely agreed on the content of the term democracy. There does seem to have been among some of the American founding fathers a tendency to identify democracy rigorously with one of its manifestations, direct democracy, a limitation of the term for which Rousseau might have to be held responsible. This is evident when we read Madison's definition of democracy in The Federalist, Numbers 10 and 14, or John Adams' attack on democracy in his defense of the Constitution of the United States of America. Yet the case of John Adams is not entirely clear. A more complete perusal of his writings gives evidence of a strong opposition to the egalitarian principle, and we also know that he had qualms of conscience for having abetted the American Revolution insofar as it was the forerunner of the French Revolution and its sanguinary aftermath. Alexander Hamilton vehemently criticized democracy in his speeches on June 21, 1788, on the compromise of the Constitution, and in the Federal Convention on June 26, 1787. In fact, Gouverneur Morris ascribed Hamilton's opposition to republicanism to his confusion of republicanism with democracy. There should be no doubt whatever that the vast majority of the Founding Fathers not only detested and opposed direct democracy but, as strict Republicans, they were also deeply critical of most of the principles of indirect democracy. Thomas Jefferson is often glibly called a Democrat and the founder of Jeffersonian democracy, as opposed to Jacksonian democracy. Yet when we analyze the contents of democracy in its direct as well as in its indirect form, we must come to the conclusion that his stand was not democratic at all. Dr. Mortimer Adler quite rightly rejects Jefferson as a Democrat and insists that the dawn of American democracy really begins with Jackson. What, then, are the precepts of democracy? It has only two postulates: 1. Legal and political equality, franchise, for all, and 2. Self-government based on the rule of the majority of equals. Depending on the manner of exercise of this self-government by the whole populace or by representatives, we speak of direct or indirect democracy. It is also obvious that the representatives in an indirect democracy have the duty of repeating the views of the electorate. In the opposite case, we have a republic rather than a democracy. The respective minorities, moreover, the freedom of speech, the limitations imposed upon the rule of majorities have nothing to do with democracy as such. These are liberal tenets, they may or may not be present in a democracy. Jefferson actually was an agrarian romantic who dreamt of a republic governed by an elite of character and intellect, and based on the support of a free yeomanry. This is evident when he writes in a letter to John Adams, dated October 28, 1814. The natural aristocracy I consider as the most precious gift of nature, for the instruction, the trusts and government of society. And indeed, it would have been inconsistent in creation to have formed men for the social state, and not to have provided virtue and wisdom enough to manage the concerns of society. May we not even say that that form of government is the best which provides most effectually for a pure selection of these natural aristoi into the offices of government? And in another page of the same letter he adds, every one by his property, or by his satisfactory situation, is interested in the support of law and order. And such men may safely and advantageously reserve to themselves wholesome control over their public affairs, and a degree of freedom, which in the hands of the canaille of the cities of Europe, would be instantly perverted to the demolition and destruction of everything public. His rejection of an urban proletariat was so outspoken that it is difficult to see how he could have been elevated, even temporarily, to the august position of patron saint of the common man. He wrote, for instance, the mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government, as sores do to the strength of the human body. I consider the class of artificers as the panderers of vice, and the instruments by which the liberties of a country are generally overturned. In his later age his views mellowed somewhat, but he seems to have opposed female suffrage at all times. His agrarianism never subsided, although it found its most concrete expression in his younger years. In that spirit he wrote to Madison a letter, dated December 20, 1787. I think that our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries, as long as they are chiefly agricultural, and this will be as long as there are vacant lands in any part of America. When they get piled upon one another as in the large cities of Europe, they will become corrupt as in Europe. The expressions democrat and democracy hardly occur in the Monticello edition of Jefferson's works. In a letter addressed to Washington on May 17, 1792, he called himself a Republican Federalist, and in his first inaugural address he insisted that he was a Federalist and a Republican. But when Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams for the presidency in 1828, he was called by some of his supporters a Democratic Republican, since both candidates used the Republican label. Van Buren prided himself on being a Republican, but the term Democratic was again used by Pierce in 1852. Yet the founder of American democracy undoubtedly remains Andrew Jackson, whose monument in Washington is in front of the White House, surrounded by the statues of 4 European noblemen who fought in America for liberty, but not for equality or majority rule: Tadeusz Kościuszko, Baron von Steuben, the Marquis de Lafayette and the Comte de Rochambeau. Pulaski and Baron de Kalb have their representations in stone elsewhere. Those who want to avoid confusion, and insist on clarity in political thinking, by carefully trying to distinguish between liberalism and democracy and between democracy and republicanism, are probably fighting a losing battle. Most people are not usually aware of the fact that one of the most important differences between the continental and the Anglo-Saxon tradition of representative government has to be found in the important alloy which has been, so far, the almost inseparable concomitant of the latter, Whiggery, or liberalism in the classic sense. The names and works of 19th and 20th century thinkers who have carefully distinguished between democracy and liberalism will be found in the next chapter, note 58. But the vast majority of Americans and Englishmen talking about democracy always include the liberal element in their concept of democracy, and this in spite of the fact that democracy and liberalism are concerned with two entirely different problems. The former is concerned with the question of who should be vested with ruling authority, while the latter deals with the freedom of the individual, regardless of who carries on the government. A democracy can be highly illiberal. The Volstead Act, quite democratically voted for, interfered with the dinner menus of millions of citizens. Fascism, national and international socialism repeatedly insisted that they were in essence democratic, a claim which must be viewed in a strict philosophical and historical setting, and in this view becomes less hypocritical than observers in the Western Hemisphere are wont to admit. The Soviet use of the democratic label is by no means a shrewd political maneuver of recent years, but a terminology already adopted by Lenin and continued by Stalin throughout the 1920s. If we accept St. Thomas' definition of democracy, de regimum principium, we will find that the dictatorship of the proletariat, provided the proletariat forms a majority, is more democratic than the American Constitution, in which, in contrast to the sacred books of communism, the word democracy never figures. On the other hand, we can imagine an absolute ruler, an autocratic emperor, for instance, who is a thoroughgoing liberal. Although it is obvious that he cannot be democratic in the political sense. 51% of a nation can establish a totalitarian regime, suppress minorities and still remain democratic, while an old-fashioned dictator might reserve to himself only a very few prerogatives, scrupulously refraining from interfering in the private sphere of the citizens. There is little doubt that the American Congress or the French Chambers have a power over their nations which would rouse the envy of a Louis XIV or a George III, were they alive today. Not only prohibition, but also the income tax declaration, selective service, obligatory schooling, the fingerprinting of blameless citizens, premarital blood tests, none of these totalitarian measures would even the royal absolutism of the 17th century have dared to introduce. After having established the character of the difference between democracy and liberalism, we would like to give a few hints as to the plan of this book, which consists of selected chapters on this subject, studies and essays which do not cover the whole ground, but represent an effort to throw some light on various aspects of the problem. The first, Democracy and Totalitarianism, the Prophets, deals with the apprehensions of thinkers and observers who lived between 1790 and 1914 and, in true Platonic fashion, fear the rise of totalitarian tyranny as an evolutionary or dialectic process from the very essence of democracy. We have tried to coordinate their views with those of our contemporaries, and thus to offer to the reader a sample of the history of ideas. The second, A Critique of Democracy, which has been previously published in a somewhat different form, in New Scholasticism, July, 1946, deals with the weaknesses and inherent dangers of the democratic doctrine. In this as well as in the two following essays, our field of investigation is that of political sciences, and our investigation itself is based on a specific philosophy. The third, Democracy and Monarchy, a Study in Comparative Government, is a continuation of the second, while the fourth, The Political Temper of Catholic Nations, tries to revise the picture as to the inherent liberalism and anarchic tendencies of the Catholic nations, as well as to analyze the probability of democracy becoming a going concern in the larger part of Europe. The fact that only 13% of the European continent is Protestant, and that Catholicism is also the dominant religion in the Western Hemisphere, shows the importance of such research. The next two studies are of a historical nature. The fifth, Hus, Luther, and National Socialism, traces the direct influence of Hus on Mussolini, his Italian interpreter, and on the Czech National Socialists of 1897, and also the influence of Hus on Luther and of Luther on the German National Socialists. The last contribution tries to clear up a most dangerous misunderstanding. It deals with the historical and intellectual background of the Nazi Party, and we have given it the title The Rise of the National Socialist Party. It is based on thorough factual documentation. A slightly condensed version has already appeared in the Journal of the History of Ideas, 9, No. 3, June, 1948, 338-71. We conclude with a short summary, pointing out some conclusions from the facts assembled. We leave it to the reader to draw others. And although at present the dice are heavily loaded, only time will tell whether freedom, equality, or, perhaps, inequality with a new servitude will prevail.